After the not so bad but definitely super unoriginal Macross 2 Lovers Again, the Macross franchise remained silent for almost 2 years. Was this the end of the legendary Super Dimension Fortress Macross? Was repetitive culture the true enemy that would bring the end to the pioneers? Fortunately, that was not the case, as in the mid-90s, Shoji Kawamori and the younglings Shinichiro Watanabe and Yoko Kanno surprised us all with a true sequel to the original Macross TV show from way back in the 80s. Released in 1994 for the 10th anniversary of Do You Remember Love, Macross Plus was conceived as a 4-episode anime OVA, later as a movie, even though it was actually first envisioned as a movie. Anyway, this was totally groundbreaking, since not only was the prior Macross story not so well received, but previously Kawamori himself said that he didn't want to return to the same world of Macross. And if we think about it, he has actually kept that promise, since every Macross story from Plus and onward has been very different from the original saga, keeping only the Valkyries, the songs, and the romances. As I was saying, Macross Plus had a lot of eyes and pressure over it. First, for being the triumphant return of creator Kawamori to the franchise, and second, because Macross 2 played it very safe with its story, so Plus had to be super bombastic to capture again its dwindling audience. And oh boy, did it catch lightning in a bottle for the second time. Macross Plus is a super experimental work of art aimed towards an older audience. The plot is miles away from the original intergalactic war between humans and aliens, and even though it's way less grandiose, it feels equally, if not more important. The romance is still there, it's just entwined a little bit more with the Valkyries. And speaking of them, they are still there, just with newer designs that definitely cemented the fact that technology, just as in our world, does indeed advance in the Macross world timeline. And let's remember that this anime came out as an OVA in the 90s, a time where OVAs were super experimental and had very big and ambitious ideas. And also, the 90s was an era where technology was almost thought of as magic. Remember all the chaos that the Y2K was supposed to cause and ended up causing nothing? Well, fiction in that era leaned a lot towards hacker culture, virus, and AI as the big bad enemy. And obviously, Macross leaned towards that trend with the wonderfully epileptic and electronic music diva Sharon Apple. Back to the story, it's a very weird plot. Not weird in a bad way, it's just that I don't think that any of the newer Macross stories are played like that. With 7, we have the soldiers of Battle 7 and Fire Bomber against the Proto-Devil. In 0, we have the conflict between the new fighters and the Birdman, but it's mostly humans against humans. Then we have the majestic Macross frontier with the SMS against the Badger, and even in Delta we have the Chaos private military against the Windermere Aerial Knights. And sure, we can say that in Plus we have Valkyrie against Valkyrie and an evil songstress not unlike the emulators or even the more recent Windermerean. But it's not really played as straightforward as that. No, here we have an AI attack on Macross City, a super bizarre but super entertaining original soundtrack, 2 grown men locked in a superiority battle, a jaded songstress turned producer that has a dark past triangle with the 2 aforementioned men, and beautiful Valkyrie dogfights. So yeah, it has all the Macross elements for it to be a solid piece, but it definitely goes above and beyond what was previously understood as Macross. So my friends, I'm Absa, and it's time now to explore the marvel that Macross Plus was and how to my knowledge and the fact that I haven't watched the new Delta movie, none of the next entries of Macross are as experimental as this story. As per usual, let's talk a little bit about the context of Plus first. The 80s saw the birth of Macross, and with Do You Remember Love, the franchise soared in popularity. Sometime later, the saga of the SDF-1 reached its conclusion and a new story seed was planted with the launch of the SDF-2 Mecha 1 that saw the light in Flashback 2012. But to this day, that story seemingly ended there. In the 90s, Macross 2 tried to capture the magic of the original saga, but failed miserably because it was a very derivative piece of art. On the other hand, we already knew that Kawamori didn't want to return to the same franchise as he already explored everything regarding the Misa, Minmay, Ichijo love triangle and the human zentradi war. So what happens next? How do you continue a story that has already reached its natural end and the supposed new saga fell completely short? And well, if you're a self-described pioneer as Kawamori, the answer is easy: innovation. Instead of moving 80 years to the future, you move just over a generation, approximately 30 years. This way, in story, people are still familiar with the First Space War, but things are surely different. Humans and Zentrans have been exploring the galaxy for decades now and finally found other worlds to settle. The UN Spacey is still wary of alien threats, so Valkyrie technology and carrier and assault ships are still moving forward. We even have a new project whose main purpose is to test in a very head-to-head combat trial the new prototype Valkyries, the YF-19 and the YF-21. Music also continued to evolve, and even though there hasn't been anyone near Lin Minmay's fame, there's a new virtual diva in town that has been gaining a lot of attention. So, in a very organic and clever way, Kawamori did not return to the original franchise, but to an evolved state of that same setting. He purposely left everything regarding the SDF-1 behind and managed to create a new piece of art that not only honors the past but actually moves the story forward, and with that he was able to come up with completely different story threads. To his credit, that same approach has been used in all of the new Macross entries, from 7 to Delta, always adding new elements to the Macross mythos but keeping enough of them so that the story never feels unconnected or out of line. That's the true magic of Kawamori and his crew and what has kept the Macross Chronicle so interesting all of these years. Yet, Macross Plus is all that and also something entirely special. You see, in the early 90s, the Macross tropes as we know them, the alien threats, the new idols, the private armies, the supernatural aspect of songs, were not so well established nor set in stone. And in total honesty, nobody knew what to expect after the lackluster Macross 2. So Kawamori had a lot of leeway to tell his new story. Given the fact that Plus and 7 were being developed at more or less the same time, we can go ahead and say that Plus was the experimental side of Macross, and 7 was the traditional. Well, traditional-ish. Think of it like this. With Plus, the creative team could go anywhere since it was an OVA sidequel, and also the more traditional 7 was going to come out anyway, so with Plus, imagination reigned supreme. Something similar, well, kind of similar happened a little bit later with Macross Zero, as it can more or less be seen as another semi-experimental series that, despite being a prequel of the original TV show, it paved the way for Frontier and Delta, with those series serving as a more formal and direct continuation of the whole Macross saga. Anyway, Macross Plus is all in all a true and tried Macross story, but it inverts and or subverts some elements, making it feel familiar yet new and exciting. Kawamori, Itano and his crew even went ahead and traveled to the real-life Edwards Air Force Base in Edwards, California for a few training sessions with Dogfighting School Air Combat USA. This experience gave them a true feel of the aerodynamics, controls and even engineerings of an airship, so we can actually feel in the Valkyrie battles the excitement and freshness that the crew probably felt in there. And yeah, well, by this time you may be wondering, hey Absa, are you going to talk about the plot of Plus, or will you blatantly skip it like in the Gundam F91 video? And don't worry, I'll definitely talk a little bit about the most important plot points of Macross Plus, as you know that I really don't like summary videos, so I'm not going to summarize the story. With that said, let's now get into spoiler territory. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to talk about the movie experience, not the OVAs, so let's go ahead. Seen through a very simplistic lens, the story of Macross Plus gets rid of the interstellar war from previous franchise iterations and focuses on the rivalry of two childhood friends, Isamu Dyson, the ace pilot behind the YF-19, and Gald Bowman, the ace pilot behind the YF-21. Both want to win the Project Supernova contest and prove that their company's airship is the best suited to be the true successor to the BF-11 Thunderbolt. Also, they both want to win the heavy heart of their mutual friend, ex-songstress now turned producer Myung Fan Long. All meanwhile, the virtual diva Sharon Apple is conquering the hearts of everyone. And secretly, the UN Spacey is tinkering with unmanned, artificial intelligence-guided fighting aircraft who may or may not bring the end to the concept of pilots as we know it. Right away, a few things sound like Macross, but are now presented in a very different way. The love triangle is now inverted, with 2 males and 1 female, and it has a tragic past. The main war is now a contest between 2 experimental Valkyries and a secret AI vehicle, with added wing of Isamu being human and Gald being half-centered. And the songstress, well, she or it is now a virtual diva that allegedly has an artificial mind of its own and has the power to entrance human and Centurion alike with her eerie songs. Everything sounds familiar, right? Yet, it's not quite the same. The story starts with Isamu being a super hot-headed pilot that then gets transferred to Eden Planet for Project Supernova, the aforementioned contest to find the successor for the BF-11. Here, he re-encounters with Gald, his former childhood friend now turned rival pilot. Isamu, Gald and Myung were 3 impossible to separate friends who constantly cheered on each other. Isamu and Gald trying to be the best flyers, and Myung the next Lin Minmei. Yet, something dark happened between the 3 and Isamu decided to return to Earth, so for many years the trio was no more. Until present day, when Myung is back on Eden as producer for Miss Apple's Grand Galactic Tour. The thing here is that their reunion is not at all happy or cheerful. We can actually see the strain in their eyes and their heavy expressions. It's not a grand reunion, more like a tragic one, as if ghosts from the past started to reappear when the trio met again. We'll later understand why they acted the way they acted, but suffice to say that they were on Eden for work, not for play. Speaking of work, I already said that both Isamu and Gald were the chosen pilots for the new prototype Valkyries. Yet, I have not talked at all about the YF-19 and the YF-21. Remember that Kawamori decided to use the Jolly Roger skull and crossbone flag for the Skull Squadron for the original Macross? Well, taking again a dive into American airship history, the Project Supernova contest between the experimental Valkyries was based on the Advanced Tactical Fighter program of the 1980s. In fact, the YF-21's design was heavily influenced by the Northrop YF-23, while the YF-19 resembles the Grumman X-29, one of the most promising forward-swept wing aircrafts. Obviously, Kawamori modified the design a lot, but seeing them side by side, we can definitely see the inspiration. And for me, this is what's truly amazing about Macross Plus and well, Macross in general, the fact that Kawamori is aware of the newest innovations of real aircraft technology. In story, the YF-21 is controlled through the use of a mind-machine brainwave control system, and also it uses zentradi technology for the Batroid mode by adopting an enhanced version of the Kedlun raw control system. And well, all that translates to a YF-21 that is controlled directly by Gold's mind, and it shares a similar mechanical silhouette to that of the original zentradi mechas. On the other hand, the YF-19 is also the first Valkyrie to introduce the forward swept wing, and aside that, it's the more traditional looking Valkyrie among the two. It also features a color scheme similar to Ichijo's original Valkyrie from the Vermilion Squad. And to be totally honest, I prefer the YF-21. It's a weird design. I'll go all the way and even say that at first I didn't like the forward swept wing aircraft. Not the YF-19, nor even the Excalibur, and definitely not the Fire Valkyrie of Basra. But that changed with the BF-31 Siegfried from Delta, yet I'm getting super ahead of myself. Spoiler alert, the YF-19 won the contest, but not for the reason you may think, and also this would not be the last time that we saw the YF-21. It will later return as the BF-22 Sturmvogel 2, piloted by the one and only Max Genius, but I'll talk more of him and Macross 7 in another video. Oh, and if you're getting confused with all of the letters and numbers of the Valkyries, don't worry, it's not that complicated. Valkyries that start with the letter Y are prototypes or experimental, while the official ones use the letter V. Anyway, without getting too much into the mechanical design aspect of the Valkyries, I'll end this part by saying that I was very glad to see new fighters that were very different from one another. The visual aspect of the aircraft was super important for the original series, and even though the Valkyries from Macross 2 were different, it was very subtle. Here in Plus, we can definitely see that Kawamori went all in to try to redesign from the ground up newer Valkyries that would have an everlasting impact, just like the original BF-1 way back from the 80s. Back to the story. During the concert in Eden, we found out that Sharon Apple is not in fact a complete AI, as it doesn't have an emotional core. We learn that Myung is the real Shadow Star, as she is the one that provides the voice, thoughts and emotions to Sharon. But Sharon is so loved that as the 30th anniversary of the first Space War is approaching, she is invited to the OG Macross City on Earth to celebrate. At more or less that same time, and after a lot of tests between Izumo and Gold, the director of Project Supernova is finally informed that the UN Spacey is shutting down that program in favor of the development of unmanned AI-guided X-9 Ghost drone fighter aircraft. The decision was informed by the fact that without the human element, the maneuverability, firepower and performance aspects would greatly improve. And until this moment, everything sounds okay but kind of disconnected, right? Well, here's where things get ugly and all messed up. Another member of the Sharon Apple crew was March Gualdoa, a UN Spacey scientist who wanted to perfect an AI program that was able to be used in the military. And remember that Sharon was incomplete? Well, yeah, in a very 90s plot twist, Mr. March gets hold of an untested and illegal bioneural chip that had the capabilities to make an AI fully sentient. So finally, after all this time, Sharon was alive without the need of Myung. He kind of created the Matrix way before the Matrix. Anyway, in another very 90s trope, after realizing that his magnum opus was alive and in control, Mr. March committed suicide atop the SDF-1. This is all happening at the same time of Sharon's concert, so now we have an AI capable of independent thought with songs that are able to fully entrance humans and zentradi alike, and also exactly where her concert was taking place, we have a new drone fighter that was AI controlled. Could that combination go wrong? Of course it goes wrong. Sharon is now trying to take over Macross City on Earth with her songs and by controlling the X9 ghost. Okay, let's pause a little bit. Remember that in Macross 2, music was used against the UN Spacey, but it felt really cheap and unoriginal? In practice, Macross Plus is doing exactly the same thing, yet it feels much more interesting thanks to the way it was presented. Here we have an inversion of the original trope. Min-Mei was able to entrance zentradi to stop fighting. Sharon, the digital songstress, is doing exactly the same to humans and Zentran. Yet her intention is exactly the opposite: submit humanity and zentradi to her control. What follows next is the triumphant yet blatant stealing of the YF-19 and 21 by Isamu and Gold to go to Earth and rescue Macross City and of course Myung, since by now we already knew that the reason that the trio got separated in their youth was the fact that Gold tried to assault Myung and Isamu tried to stop him. Yet he reinterpreted those events as Isamu being the one molesting Myung. Gold got it all wrong, and given that huge misunderstanding, everything went downhill from there. This is very interesting as the whole love triangle is now being told as a very dark and tragic story that never reached the happily ever after conclusion of the Mise, Min-Mei, Hikaru triangle from before. Again, same element, whole other perspective. And yes, I know, I am skipping a lot of background and or story elements, but I told you, I am not going to summarize the story. I refuse to do summarizing videos. Back to the Earth Sphere, the Sharon-controlled X9 Ghost is absolutely crushing both Valkyries, and on the SDF-1, that same Sharon is torturing Myung. Both pilots reach the conclusion that they won't be able to get rid of the drone in time to save Myung, so Gold, trying to get some redemption for his acts, tells Isamu to go and save her while he will disable the limiters of the YF-21 and go head to head with the X9 Ghost. This is a very action-packed scene that shines the brightest in the movies, as there is additional footage where we see how the pressure of the movements of the Valkyries inflict damage to its pilot. And in a very courageous and heroic act, Gold is able to destroy the drone by crushing it with his Valkyrie. And I don't know if it was meant to be seen or interpreted this way, but this whole scene is also very symbolic. Two men fighting a ghost from another time that is totally crushing them and separating them from their loved ones. And in order to end the suffering, the one who carried with the most guilt had to sacrifice his life so the ghost could finally be vanquished, all while the other one went to try and save the girl. On the SDF-1, Myung and Isamu get rid of Sharon's mind control and are able to stop her by destroying her base form. This is a little bit weird now, since we know that information can be stored in different servers and the fact that you destroy one doesn't destroy the whole info. But really, the concept of cloud computing was not implemented nor popularized until many years later, so don't worry, I won't delve into it. All in all, Macross Plus is a great experience. I really like the story, and in my opinion, the movie does a better job at delivering it. Kawamori and his crew grabbed almost every trope that made the original Super Dimension Macross great and reused them in a very different and exciting way. The Valkyries were updated and made to fight between them. The love triangle mutated to one tragic and unfinished one, and the whole concept of the songstress was turned head to toes by giving us a crazy virtual diva. Is it better than the original? I won't dare to answer that, but it's miles better than Macross 2 Lovers Again. Is Macross Plus able to transcend the limitations that the original story presented with the themes introduced there? Definitely! Macross Plus moves the whole Macross chronology, aesthetics, and story elements to its natural progression in a very organic and entertaining way. Nothing feels forced nor pulled from thin air. Macross Plus was the evolution that Macross needed for the franchise to cement itself as a living, breathing, and moving world. Now, is it better than its contemporary Macross 7? Well, many people dislike Macross 7, yet even though I thought that I hated Basara and I definitely didn't like his Valkyrie nor the whole look of the Sound Force, I really liked Firebomber's music and Max and Maria's presence. So, while not as experimental or innovative as Plus, 7 is a solid piece of fiction that returned the Macross tropes to a similar fashion, much more in vein of the original. But the Macross 7 exploration will be in another video. Something that I didn't talk about was the soundtrack. For Macross Plus, Kawamori chose the up-and-coming Yoko Kanno with recordings done all around the world. I deliberately chose not to talk about the songs because, well, let's just say that YouTube's algorithm towards Japanese music and even Japanese anime is harsh, to say the least. The music is very interesting since it mixes orchestral elements with 90s techno. So for me, it's one of the best scores or probably the most experimental of the whole Macross franchise. The OST also homages the somewhat characteristic and weird sounds of Aphex Twin, particularly in the song Bad Dog. Kanno would return for Macross Dynamite 7 and also to Macross Frontier, yet she has also worked with Kawamori in a lot of his stories, such as one of my favorite Escaflowne and also the Aquarian Saga. Anyway, I always tell to myself, this time I won't make the video as long as the previous time, but I continue to fail spectacularly. I hope that you like my exploration of one of the most experimental Macross stories that was recently re-released in theaters. Apparently, the Big West overlords were pleased with its reception and are now bringing the two Frontier movies to the big screen here in the West. And also, to end finally, what's your opinion of Macross Plus? Are you a team YF21 or a team YF19? Leave it in the comments, and as you may or may not know, my name is Absa and we can continue the conversation over at Twitter, where you can follow me at Absalonicas, and on Instagram, where I post pictures of my figures, my cats, and sometimes even myself. I'll be trying to talk more about anime, comics, and maybe even figures. I've been meaning to do some kind of experimental mechanical design analysis as a reel or as a short, but please tell me in the comments if you would like to see them. And till next time, always remember that in fiction lies power. So let's use it to forge a new type of story, our hero's journey.